My family moved to Memphis, Tennessee when I was 5 years old. And I cried all the way there because I wanted to stay with my mama.
It's 1949, and Myra Brown is saying goodbye to her extended family in rural Louisiana.
My daddy got a job as a lineman in Memphis.
Memphis, they say, is this sort of gateway into the Deep South. It really became this meeting point between white and black music, between country and early sort of rockabilly, hillbilly music, and African-American music, gospel and R&B. And the focal point for Memphis music at that time is Sam Phillips and Sun Records.
Myra's dad, J.W., is a bass player, and he's quick to discover that Memphis is an epicenter for a new kind of music, rock and roll.
Sam Phillips brought together many of the musicians from the South to create this new sound. He is the one who discovered Elvis Presley, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. Sun Records, it's the birthplace of rock and roll.
When J.W. suffers a serious electrical accident at work, he gets a large settlement. It's the catalyst for a career change.
My daddy said, I'm going to go to Louisiana and find my cousin Jerry and see if he'll come to Memphis and we'll put together a band. He said, I've heard how great he is on the piano, how talented he is.
Only 21 years old, Jerry Lee Lewis has already been married twice. The first time when he was 16.
In the South, people got married young, that they started having kids really young, and that then they had a lot of them. That's the story of the Lewis family.
Jerry Lee now lives with his second wife, Jane, in Faraday, Louisiana.
Daddy found Jerry working at a little dive called the Wagon Wheel. Daddy went over and introduced himself and said, I would like for you to stay at my house as my guest. I'll take you to Sun Record, introduce you to Sam Phillips, and let's see about getting a contract. The phone rings, and I'm this 12-year-old kid. The man says, can I speak to J.W.? I need to get directions to your house. Jerry came in, and he was wearing a red plaid shirt. He had a haircut that was way too short because his ears stuck out. And he just looked like nothing special. But then he started playing the piano and immediately got my attention. It was like we were all mesmerized because he was just so good on the piano. My opinion changed drastically of him. His haircut didn't matter anymore.
I was 3 years old when he moved into our house. They practiced in the living room for a while, and his hands were so fast, it was just like they were in double motion. It was like he had four hands. It was just hard to believe that he could play it like that. And the man was a great musician.
Then Daddy took Jerry to Sun Records and had him audition. And that's how it all began. His first record was End of the Road and Crazy Arms. One day in the studio, my daddy said to him, Jerry, play that Shakin' song. Because when they were traveling and doing shows, Jerry would do that song and the audience would just react like crazy. And that was Whole Lotta Shakin'. And the first time Sam heard it, it was like, this is it, you know.
Myra has just turned 13 when her dad and Jerry fly to New York with their band to make their debut on live national television.
Mom and I were at home watching television, and you knew something great was coming out of this. just seeing him on Steve Allen's show, he rose in my mind, to a higher level.
It is safe to say that the overwhelming majority of the network TV viewing audience would never have seen anything like Jerry Lee Lewis before in their lives.
Oh, shake, baby. You can shake one time for me.
And for a young girl growing up in the South, just the notion that you would know somebody who would be on television was almost beyond imagination.
I was 13 years old. He became a little god in my mind and in a lot of people's mind at that time.
And when a whole lot of shaking hit, they went up to $10,000 a show. Now this is in the 50s, that's a lot of money.
Clearly, Steve Allen got a kick out of him. Very soon after, he booked him to come back on.
Mr. Commotion himself, Jerry Lee Lewis.
So to get a second bite at that apple, national television, that was a big deal.
Goodness gracious, great balls of fire.
As Jerry's fame skyrockets, his marriage falls apart.
He knew what time school let out, and he would go up there. He'd say, hey, you want to go get some ice cream? And he always knew I wanted to go get ice cream. Jerry and I, we would go to a movie after dinner or something like that. I thought he was being nice to a kid. I thought it was that kind of thing. Like pat the kid on top of the head or something. I was idolizing Jerry and looking up to him and thinking he's this great big star. What I didn't know was that he was falling in love with me.
Myra's parents had no idea that Jerry Lee was wooing their daughter. They knew the two had fun together, they knew they were friends, but it truly didn't occur to them that this older man would try to have a relationship with their child.
After supper or something, we'd drive up to the A&W or whatever it is. And Jerry would kiss me. At first, I didn't know what to think about that. I mean, it was nice, but I was confused. I was like, I'm 13 years old. So it really messes with your mind. You don't understand what's going on. But you don't want it to stop either, because it was you liked it. But that's how our relationship was.
Jerry never asked Myra to get married, per se. He got the marriage license by taking this older friend, I think she was in her 20s as well, to the courthouse and having her sign Myra's name to the license. Nobody questioned it. Apparently they didn't ask for ID back in those days.
And Jerry came back home. He said, come outside, I'm gonna show you something. So he pulled this paper out, and I looked at it, and it said, marriage license. And I looked at it, and I said, you mean we're married? And he said, no. We're not married, we're gonna get married. And I said, what? And he caught me by my arm, and he turned me around, and he said, Myra, I love you, and I want to marry you. And I think I just melted, I think it just, and I told him, and I said, no, I love you too. I said, but I'm still too young. This is crazy.
I think Jerry Lee was a predator. He wanted somebody he could mold into whoever he wanted. Myra was a good, dutiful girl, and so she was an easy mark for him.
December 12th, 1957 marks a crazy new chapter in 13-year-old Myra Brown's life.
We were having supper. Jerry said, Myra, you want to go to a movie? I said, yeah, sure. We got in the car, And Jerry headed toward Mississippi. And I'm going, was there a movie theater out this way? And he said, no, we're going to get married. He had found this pastor or whoever it was that was going to marry us. And I think I was in a coma. I think my eyes were like this. And I got out of the car. I had on the red dress that I wore to school that day. And we walked in this little chapel. I don't remember getting married, but I know it happened. And then these two little old ladies started throwing rice at us and all this kind of stuff. And I'm still like a deer caught in headlights. Now, we've gone down there and gotten married and turned around and came right back. And we were probably gone less than an hour. The next morning, I got up and I pulled my marriage license out, and I left them laying out on the nightstand. And my mother's maid found them. And she handed my daddy the marriage license. And of course, he took one look at it. And my daddy went and got his gun. And he said, I'm gonna go kill that son of a bitch.
He got in the car and took off. And Jerry was up at Sun Records at that time. Mama called Sam Phillips and said, Jay's on the way and he's got a gun. Is Jerry still there?
And Sam turned around and he looked at Jerry and he said, get in your car and get out of Memphis. So Jerry took off. Daddy drops up, barrels through the front door and says, where is that son of a bitch? And Sam sits Daddy down and tells him, we can't interfere in this life decision that's been made without you.
And he said, it looks to me like they love each other. And if we charge him, he's going to prison for a long time.
Daddy calms down and he goes back home and he tells Mom, we really don't have any choices because it's done. And we're going to have to hope for the best and learn to live with it.
It's against the law for married women to go to school in Tennessee. So 13-year-old Myra joins Jerry out on tour.
I didn't have a suitcase. The only thing I had was this round doll case that I had gotten at a Christmas or two before. And it was like a hat box, shaped like a hat box. And that's what I put my stuff in.
The next time JW sees Jerry is on stage at a gig in New York.
Jerry goes over to Daddy and he says, I love Myra, I'll take care of her. Music starts playing and it's accepted, it's forgotten. We went out and bought a little house. Actually, we bought the first house that had a for sale sign on it because we needed a house right away. I learned how to cook and learned how to vacuum. I had to become the adult. Jerry did two things. He played music and he loved me. He came home, he brought all the money to me, dumped it in my lap.
I mean, it was a cash business. And Myra was in charge of taking the bags full of cash from his live performances to the bank. You really are talking about shopping bags with dollar bills in them. The notion that she was a central piece of keeping the Jerry Lee Lewis business going as a young teenager, as a girl, is pretty wild.
The first few months of 1958 tick by, and Jerry's star continues to rise.
It was a time that had never happened before, never will happen again. And the reaction of the public and the audience that made me kind of gasp. Like, look at how these people are just going berserk about him.
There for a while, he was the top dog. They had the top songs in the world.
Out of all of these figures, these kings of rock and roll, Elvis was a brilliant performer. He was cute. He had this sort of angel face. But Jerry Lee Lewis could play the piano better than anyone that was a part of this whole Sun Records crew. And Jerry Lee Lewis was fun. And fun was a huge part of the birth of rock and roll.
Private Elvis Presley makes this a VIP event. But the rock and roll star, wearing medals for carbine, pistol, and tank gunnery marksmanship, is modest as can be.
When Elvis is drafted into the Army, Jerry Lee is poised to become the new king of rock and roll.
And then they booked a big tour for Jerry in Europe in May of '58.
Elvis never went to England. Elvis never formed off of United States soil. So for one of those first-generation rock and rollers to make that trip and go over to England was a big deal.
The tour will be a surefire success if Jerry will heed the advice of Sam Phillips and not do one thing.
Don't bring Myra on tour with you. Don't bring her to London. And he ignored all of that good advice. His ego, I think, stood in the way. He just thought he was untouchable.
I didn't even know that Jerry had been warned. And he said to them, either she goes or I don't. And I think Jerry intimidated him and said, don't you talk to her. Leave my wife alone.
Myra, her brother Rusty, and their mom Lois accompany the band to England.
When we got there, they were standing there at the airport and, people just wanted to see everybody, because we were the biggest celebrities there was at that time.
The press was going to come on the plane and see Jerry and interview him. So I got off, and I'm walking around in the airport, and a man comes up to me, and he says, who are you, miss? You got off that plane, didn't you? And I said, I'm not anybody. He said, well, who are you? And I said, I'm Jerry's wife. And the guy asked me how old I was, and I said, I'm 15. I figured I could lie a little bit. His face lit up like a Christmas tree, and he took off. I had no idea. I was talking to a reporter. And I'm clueless that there could be a problem. I wish that somebody would have said, if people find out Jerry's married to a kid, it ain't gonna be pretty. Myra, you're a bomb.
It's May 1958, and the news of 13-year-old Myra Lewis's marriage to Jerry Lee is about to erupt in the British press. Initially, Jerry's British fans give him a warm reception.
They were at the airport. They were out in the streets. They were in the lobby. People loved Jerry so much, they were hanging out of the hotel windows all around our hotel.
But the tone abruptly changes the following day.
The reporter followed up, figured out Myra was 13, figured out she was his cousin, and that Jerry Lee Lewis wasn't actually even divorced from his second wife yet. This was a bombshell.
The next morning, the news media said, Jerry Lee Lewis is here with his child bride, Myra.
He's a pedophile, he's a bigamist, he's a liar and a fraud. There's a call to boycott the shows, and very quickly, Jerry Lee finds himself playing to half-empty theaters where people are heckling and booing him.
And they went after Jerry Lee, they went after Myra. She was in the car with her mother and her little brother. The paparazzi surrounded the car and they were shaking it so violently, they thought the car was going to be turned over.
And Scotland Yard came to the hotel and told us, we can't guarantee your safety.
They end up coming back to America, where they hoped it would blow over, but nothing blew over.
Why did you leave?
Well, I don't answer those questions, sir. My manager might knock my head off or something.
That one event turned our life upside down and changed the direction of everything. Nobody wanted to be a part of this.
Were you there, Mrs. Lewis?
I was there, but I wasn't at the show.
Oh, you weren't at the shows. Oh, did you notice anything like that sort of reception?
No, it was a very good reception, I thought.
He went from making thousands of dollars a night down to making a few $100s a night. I felt guilty because of it. I didn't make it happen, but I didn't stop it from happening. And I could have, because I was the one that let the cat out of the bag.
After they came back and after his divorce was finalized, he remarried Myra so that there was no question that this was a marriage in good standing, but the damage was done.
It destroyed a man's career, but it didn't destroy our marriage. If anything, it made it stronger because we were attacked. We don't care what the world says or does. We should love each other.
Soon, Myra is overjoyed to learn that she's pregnant.
I always loved children.
What I had wanted all my life was a house, a home, and a baby.
But a few months into her pregnancy, Myra is forced to leave her home.
Jerry wasn't having the income that he had, and he was the sole supporter of his mother, father, and 2 sisters. So my house got shut down, not theirs. And I had to go live with them in Faraday, Louisiana. It was not comfortable because they resented the fact that Jerry married me. It was not a fun situation to live in the house with those people. One day, Jerry walked into the room and he reached down and he picked up my typewriter and he held it above his head like he was gonna slam it down on me. And I looked up at him and it's like, what happened? And he threw it on the floor. And he said, one of his sisters, Linda Gale, told me that she was with you the other day and y'all were driving down the road and you were smoking a cigarette and flirting with a sailor. Neither one was true. The only reason she would tell him that was to make him mad at me.
But all is forgiven when Myra gives birth to a baby boy on February 27th, 1959.
Myra had Stevie when she was 14 years old, and she was thrilled. She knew she was pretty young to be having one, but still, it was what she always wanted.
Oh, he was precious. He was a sweet baby. He was a smart baby. Jerry wanted to name him after Steve Allen for giving him his first break on nationwide television.
Myra is over the moon when they move back to Memphis and her mom, dad, and brother get to meet her baby boy.
It was great because it was like I had a little brother, you know, because I was with him all the time. You know, and she was a great mama.
In 1960, the Lewises learn that Elvis has returned to Memphis from his stint in the Army. And just like Jerry, Elvis has fallen in love with a teenage girl.
Elvis Presley was in love with Priscilla when he was 24 and she was 14. Luckily for him, he had Jerry Lee Lewis's example.
Clearly, Elvis's team learned from the disaster of Jerry Lee and Myra and entered into the relationship with Priscilla in a very different way. Waited much longer on the marriage.
Priscilla Presley was beautiful and glamorous and did her hair and her makeup and was in the public eye. Jerry Lee didn't want Myra to be anything like Priscilla Presley. Myra was only to belong to him. He didn't want other men to be attracted to Myra in any way. Jerry Lee wanted Myra to be invisible.
I couldn't wear shorts. We had a swimming pool, and he didn't want me going swimming when there was other men out there. It was so uncalled for.
Only 17 years old, Myra submits to Jerry's demands and embraces her role as wife and mother. But nothing prepares her for what happens on Easter Sunday, 1962.
Myra was at home with her 3-year-old son, Stevie, her father-in-law, Elmo, and Jerry's uncle, George, and she was going to cook dinner. And she was asking Elmo what he wanted, and he was listing some things, and said, well, we better go inside and make a list. So she asked Uncle George, would you watch Stevie? And he said, sure. And so she and Elmo went inside, and she wrote a grocery list. They went back outside.
And Uncle George was there, and Stevie wasn't. And I said, Uncle George, where'd Stevie go? He said, he went in the house with you. Well, didn't he go in the house with you? I ran in the house to look for him. And I came back out. There was this, he'd been playing with a hose. And he'd been pulling it. And I followed the hose around the house. And I looked, and the hose was in the swimming pool. And the water was rippling. And I started screaming.
Myra Lewis is 17 years old when her 3-year-old son drowns in a tragic accident.
Myra remembers almost nothing between the incident at the pool and the funeral. What she remembers is Jerry Lee picking her up off of Stevie's grave. She was lying on his grave and wouldn't leave because she wouldn't leave her child alone.
I was so heartbroken over losing Stevie. I mean, it was the most God's awful thing could happen to any human on this earth.
There were times when she didn't want to go on. She didn't know if she could live without her baby, without her child. And then she got pregnant again. And it was with the birth of Phoebe that she realized she had to stay alive.
She just unbroke my heart. You know, she made me proud and happy to have a child again in my arms that I could hold and kiss, and gave me back something that I had lost. It was a welcoming, wonderful thing that happened.
In 1964, the Beatles conquer America and transform the sound of rock and roll. By this time, unable to repeat his success on the charts, Jerry Lee has left Sun Records. At home, he becomes increasingly controlling.
No matter what she did to try to please him, it was never enough. Nothing was ever good enough.
It ripped my self-esteem away from me. One night, Jerry was coming home, but I didn't know he was coming home that night. He said, I'm hungry, you got to fix me something to eat. Okay. When a neighbor had made some spaghetti sauce for me, and I walked by him and he said, this don't taste like your spaghetti. And I said, Bonnie made it and gave it to me. And he said, what? And he picked his tray up and threw it at me.
Jerry's bad behavior continues, even when he starts making a comeback in a new genre in the 1960s.
Who's gonna play this old piano after I'm not here?
He never returns as a rock and roll star, but eventually moves into a much more straight-ahead country style.
When country music kind of became outlaw country and was more sort of open to rebellious figures, they welcomed Jerry Lee Lewis.
I started playing with him a lot and then went full time with him later on, after I got out of high school.
When Another Place, Another Time shoots up the country charts in 1968, Jerry's career is on the ascent.
Jerry went from a little bit of success to more success to really being one of the most successful recording artists in the country music community by sort of the end of the 60s.
Jerry's second chance at fame is not enough to right his failing marriage.
When the good times came back for Jerry's career, things went to hell quickly. Jerry would turn into Jekyll and Hyde. Mid-afternoon, when Jerry was gone and going to play a show that night, I'd talk to him. And he'd say things like, "Hey, babe, what you doing?" Da-da-da-da-da. We'd just chit-chat, you know, normal. After the show, I could get a phone call from him. "Who the hell do you think you are telling me that I shouldn't drink liquor or something like this?" The next morning, Jerry would wake up and call me and say, "Hey, babe, what you doing?" Jekyll and Hyde.
Jerry Lee, while he was on the road, began taking drugs, and Myra noticed a drastic difference in him. He would just be totally out of control, accusing her of cheating on him while he was out of town, which was totally not Myra. He had no evidence whatsoever. He was just high on drugs.
I would imagine Myra feeling completely overwhelmed and confused. These were prescription pills, you know, they were sort of like performance enhancers. They were marketed from doctors. There wasn't the knowledge that we have today. He became a raw nerve, yelling, screaming. I mean, Jerry Lee Lewis had a terrible temper and a lot of conflict, but you take all of that and then you combine it with amphetamines and booze and sleeplessness, it's like pouring lighter fuel on a fire.
Yeah, he slapped me. Yeah, he did. That's what he would do to people. He'd slap them in the face. But when he slapped me, I would end up on the floor because the force was too hard.
Then, 12 years into her marriage, Myra gets a phone call that will ultimately destroy the relationship. Jerry Lee has been living a double life.
I just fell apart. I couldn't take another day of it.
In 1970, Myra Lewis gets a phone call that shatters her belief in Jerry Lee.
The anonymous phone call was that Jerry had been seeing other women and just picking up women on the road, and it was something that had been ongoing for many years.
In fact, he had started cheating on her only 11 months after they first got married.
Myra is devastated. She runs down to her local church to seek solace.
I knelt down at the altar and I was crying so hard that I was not even able to say a word. But that was the moment of knowing without a doubt that this was not the man I was going to spend my life with. This was not what I bargained for. I think maybe in my heart I knew that it wasn't reasonable that a man goes out and plays music and drinks and takes drugs and there's women throwing themselves at him. It's not reasonable to think he's not gonna take advantage of that. But I could, because he told me he didn't. And when I realized that it was a lie, and it had been a lie for a very long time, I knew there was no going back.
Jerry is out of town. By the time he gets home, Myra and Phoebe have moved in with JW and Lois.
Jerry was continuously calling me, want me to come back to him and all this kind of stuff. And I went over to the house to get something, and I went in and I was in the den and I heard somebody going, "Get her out the window." Jerry was in our bedroom with a girl in his bed. And I walked in there and said, "Oh, no, yeah, you miss me and you love me and you want me back, right? And this is what you're doing, laying in my bed with another woman." So I mean, I'd been gone 2 or 3 days.
He begged her to come back, but she wasn't falling for it.
And that's when she got that apartment. I went over and stayed with her while she was staying there, and they was getting her divorce. I was asleep, and I heard glass break. And I ran down the stairs, and it was Jerry. He was trying to come through the window. Jerry saw me, and I said, "What do you think you're doing?" And he said, "I just need to talk to Maya so you don't talk to her coming through the window."
I was married at 13, divorced at 26. Half of my life was spent with Jerry.
The leaving, of course, was hard. She had no education. She wasn't going to have any money because Jerry Lee didn't manage money well, and whatever they had, it was spent whenever he made it. She did get some child support as long as she would go beg for it. Jerry did see Phoebe on a regular basis. Myra always felt absolutely certain that keeping that relationship between the father and daughter was an important thing to do.
Myra relocates to Atlanta, Georgia. But as she starts to rebuild her life, Jerry starts to unravel. He's arrested for driving under the influence several times.
I was taking a lot of pills at the time, you know. Nobody had mentioned it to me or said anything about it, and I didn't know that I was in that bad a shape.
Jerry has numerous weapons violations and accidentally shoots his bass player while drunk.
Just a couple of months after shooting his bass player, Jerry Lee shows up, drunk and belligerent at Graceland, smashes his car into the front gates, is yelling for Elvis to come down, and pulls out his gun and starts firing that, and then is hauled in and arrested for that. That was the next example of chaos.
That was kind of around the same time when I decided to go into real estate. I'm here by myself. I've got a child to raise. What do I want to do?
She went back to school, got her GED. She then got her real estate license and eventually her broker's license. Myra was very successful in real estate in Atlanta, Georgia.
I was in the President's Club every year. I was a $1 million producer, and I loved every second of it.
She worked for Richard Williams. She was an agent in his firm. He was a divorced man, and she admired him immensely. And after 4 years, one day, he asked her to lunch, and the sparks flew, apparently, because they ended up getting married.
Richard Williams and I were married on June 1984. He's a gentleman. He's kind. He'll do anything in the world for me. He vacuums. I have somebody I can take care of and somebody that I know is going to take care of me. And it took a long time to get to it all, but it's been what I want.
After Myra's marriage to Richard, most news of Jerry continues to be troubling.
There are a series of marriages, many of which just end in terrible and tragic or suspect circumstances. One wife dies under very sketchy circumstances that, as reporters investigate, point toward his guilt and culpability in her death. And none of this is ever, in any serious way, investigated or explored by the authorities.
Really, sincerely, I would like to say one more time what a great honor it is to be back in London, England. I feel like this is home to me, you know. Well, this is where I first came over and I brought my little 13-year-old cousin with me. Remember that?
He was widely celebrated. He was inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in the first class. Jerry Lee also was very distinct within that first generation of rock and roll. First of all, he stayed alive longer than the rest of them, but Jerry Lee Lewis was also in a class of his own when it came to bad behavior.
But then what's behind that is this remarkable woman who took something from that, who took something beyond just being scarred by it and, was able to turn her life into something else.
I mean, there's been so many blessings and so many good things and so much good spread through our life that you got to focus on that. I'm happy with myself right now. I'm happy with what I've got. I've learned some tremendous lessons about life. And if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably do it all over again.
The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean holds secrets in its depths, but it also isolates the lands that rise above its surface. In the heart of this endless blue lies American Samoa, a tropical territory that feels entirely removed from the frantic pulse of the modern world. It is a place where the air is heavy with the scent of salt and blooming flora, where the rhythm of life is dictated not by the relentless ticking of a clock, but by the natural ebb and flow of the tides. From high above, the island reveals itself as a patchwork of vibrant greens and earthy browns, fringed by the blinding white of crushed coral shores. Small villages hug the coastline, their modest homes distinguished by corrugated metal roofs that bake beneath the fierce equatorial sun. Down below, the daily routine unfolds with a quiet, enduring grace. Indigenous residents, their skin weathered by the elements, wade into the crystalline waters to cast their fishing nets, continuing traditions that have sustained their families for generations. It is a community built on proximity, on shared labor, and on a deep, abiding trust in the neighbors who live just down the road. In this sun-drenched environment, the concept of the United States mainland, specifically its labyrinthine bureaucracy and complex financial systems, feels like an abstract rumor. The distance between the shores of Pago Pago and the polished halls of Washington, D.C., is not merely geographic, it is fundamentally conceptual. For the vast majority of the indigenous population here, life is beautifully simple and deeply rooted in the physical world. They pull their livelihood from the sea and the soil. They do not trade in digital assets. They do not navigate the intricacies of corporate finance. And crucially, they do not possess any obligation to file income taxes with the federal government of the United States. The Internal Revenue Service, a towering behemoth of authority on the mainland, holds absolutely no sway over their daily existence. To these villagers, a 9-digit social security number is little more than a dormant string of digits, a bureaucratic formality devoid of any practical value or danger. They live in a state of innocent isolation, completely unaware that in the modern era, physical distance offers no protection against an invisible digital threat. Crime, in the minds of most, is a visceral event. It is a door kicked off its hinges in the dead of night, a violent confrontation in a dark alley, a tangible loss of property that leaves physical scars. But the most devastating crimes of the 21st century do not announce themselves with shattered glass or the wail of sirens. They are executed in absolute silence, carried out not with weapons of steel, but with the quiet, rhythmic tapping of a mechanical keyboard. The violence inflicted is entirely structural, stripping away a person's security without ever disturbing the stillness of their living room. For the residents of American Samoa, the threat did not come from the ocean, nor did it arrive on a ship. It was born in the shadows of their own island, cultivated in a stifling, poorly lit room just miles from where they cast their nets into the sea. Away from the bright shores and the communal warmth of the villages, a very different kind of reality was being constructed. Inside a cramped office space, the air was stagnant, untouched by the ocean breeze. The only source of illumination was the cold, sterile blue glow radiating from a computer monitor. This artificial light washed over the face of Corina Ifopo, a 54-year-old woman who sat at the center of this suffocating darkness. Her expression was completely devoid of the warmth that characterized the island community. Instead, it was frozen in a mask of calculated intent. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a frantic, practiced velocity, each keystroke serving as a digital chisel chipping away at the foundation of her neighbors' lives. The silence of the room was broken only by the relentless clattering of the keys and the heavy, grinding machinery of a high-capacity printer. The device was operating at its absolute maximum limit, violently churning out sheet after sheet of paper. These were not ordinary documents. They were W-2 tax forms, the official records of the Internal Revenue Service, and every single one of them was a meticulously crafted lie. To understand the sheer scale of the malice unfolding in that room, one must understand the nature of identity. To a fisherman on the island, identity is tethered to his family name, his village, his physical presence in the world. But to the servers of the Internal Revenue Service, identity is entirely disconnected from the physical body. It is reduced to data, a name, a date of birth, and a social security number. Karina Ifopo understood this vulnerability with terrifying clarity. She recognized that the very isolation that protected her neighbors from the complexities of mainland law also made them the perfect victims for a mainland fraud. They would never check their credit reports. They would never inquire about federal tax withholdings. They would never suspect that their dormant digital identities could be weaponized. With chilling efficiency, Ifopo transformed the innocent residents of her island into ghosts haunting the financial systems of the United States. The computer screen told a story of impossible geography and staggering deception. A digital file bearing the name of a local fisherman, a man who had never seen snow and whose entire life was bounded by the warm Pacific waters, was subjected to a few rapid clicks of a mouse. His registered address in Pago Pago, American Samoa, was highlighted, deleted, and replaced. In its stead, Ifopo typed a new reality, Anchorage, Alaska. This simple alteration of text was a masterclass in bureaucratic manipulation. By relocating these individuals on paper to the frozen expanse of the Alaskan frontier and to various other distant states across the mainland, Ifopo wove a complex narrative of phantom employment. She fabricated entire histories of labor, claiming that these islanders were working grueling hours in mainland industries, earning substantial wages, and, most importantly, having large sums of income tax withheld from their non-existent paychecks. The audacity of the scheme was matched only by its mechanical precision. The IRS algorithms, blind to the tropical reality of the individuals in question, processed the data exactly as it was fed to them. The forms indicated that too much tax had been paid. Therefore, the system dictated that a refund must be issued. On the glowing screen, the fruits of this digital dark art began to materialize. The estimated tax refund for a single altered profile flashed across the monitor, $5,400. It was a staggering sum of money, representing more wealth than many of the victims might see in a year of grueling physical labor on the island. But for Ifopo, it was merely a single drop in an ocean of stolen capital. The cursor moved to the next file, and the process repeated itself. Another neighbor, another stolen identity, another fabricated life in a distant state, another massive refund claim. The numbers on the screen did not remain static. They multiplied with terrifying speed. 5,000 became 50,000. 50,000 swelled into 500,000. The printer continued its agonizing work, spitting out the fraudulent documentation required to support the massive digital heist. This was a factory of deception operating at peak efficiency. More than 200 people, selected precisely for their poverty, their lack of education, and their complete detachment from the mainland legal system, were unwittingly fed into the machinery of the fraud. They were harvested for their data, their names treated as nothing more than raw materials to be refined into cold, hard currency. The isolation of the island, once a protective barrier, had been inverted, becoming a trap that kept the victims entirely unaware of the catastrophic financial storm gathering over their heads. They continued to sleep soundly under their metal roofs, waking to the sound of the ocean, completely oblivious to the fact that their digital ghosts were supposedly traversing the icy landscapes of Alaska, earning taxable income, and triggering massive payouts from the federal government. The magnitude of the theft was breathtaking. As the days bled into weeks, and the weeks into months, the sheer volume of fraudulent claims pushed the cumulative total higher and higher. The digital ledger on Ifopo's computer screen tracked the incoming capital, the figures rising until they crossed a threshold that seemed impossible for a single, localized operation. $1 million. A massive, illicit fortune conjured out of thin air, built entirely on the stolen identities of the poorest, most vulnerable members of a forgotten island territory. The money flowed outward from the heavily guarded vaults of the United States Treasury, traversing the vast distance of the Pacific Ocean, not to build schools or hospitals in the territory, but to line the pockets of a predator operating in their midst. In that dark, sweltering room, bathed in the sickly blue light of the monitor, a profound violation of trust had been finalized. The physical tranquility of American Samoa remained undisturbed. The sun still rose over the Pacific, and the waves still crashed against the coral reefs. But in the invisible, digital realm where the modern world conducts its business, a catastrophic event had occurred. A trap had been set, the spring pulled tight, and the financial futures of hundreds of innocent families had been inextricably linked to a colossal federal crime. The victims had no voice in the matter, no warning of the impending devastation, and no defense against the forces that were about to descend upon their quiet lives. They were merely names on a screen, collateral damage in a relentless pursuit of wealth that would soon tear the fabric of their community apart. The machine had been set in motion, the millions claimed, and the quiet paradise of the island was sitting on a digital fault line, waiting for the inevitable, devastating earthquake to strike. Between the years 2014 and 2016, a period that felt like a mere fleeting moment in the slow and rhythmic history of the island, a sprawling apparatus of financial deception was quietly and meticulously assembled. Time on the territory usually moved with the gentle pace of the ocean tides, dictated by seasons and communal gatherings rather than fiscal quarters or federal tax deadlines. Yet, hidden away from the communal gaze, Karina Ifopo operated on an entirely different temporal plane. She was not bound by the sun or the sea, but by the relentless, accelerated timeline of mainland bureaucracy. During these 2 years, she did not simply commit a crime. She engineered a comprehensive, self-sustaining factory of fraudulent fabrication directly out of her own home. This was not a crime of passion or a sudden lapse in judgment. It was a cold, sustained campaign of economic predation, executed with the precision of a seasoned corporate strategist and the utter lack of empathy characteristic of a serial offender. Her operation required raw materials, and in the macabre arithmetic of identity theft, those raw materials were human beings. The most chilling aspect of her methodology was her selection process. She did not cast a wide, indiscriminate net across the island. Instead, she acted with surgical precision, targeting a very specific demographic within her own community. She sought out the most economically disadvantaged individuals, the poorest indigenous residents, who lived far removed from the centers of commerce and administration. These were people who possessed a profound lack of familiarity with the convoluted legal and financial systems of the United States mainland. They were individuals who had never filed a federal tax return in their entire lives, simply because their meager local incomes and geographical status entirely exempted them from such mainland obligations. They existed in a state of financial innocence, completely unaware of the vast, invisible networks of data that governed the modern world. To them, the government was a distant concept, not a daily reality. To harvest the necessary data from this vulnerable population, Ifopo weaponized the very foundation of island culture, communal trust and mutual assistance. She did not use coercion or physical force. Instead, she cloaked herself in the guise of a benevolent neighbor, a knowledgeable figure offering a helping hand to those struggling with the modern world. She approached families under the pretense of providing administrative support, offering to help them navigate complex local paperwork, secure basic territorial benefits, or simply organize their vital records. She presented herself as a savior to people who found formal bureaucracy intimidating. With a warm smile and a reassuring demeanor, she convinced hundreds of residents to hand over their most sensitive foundational documents. Weathered hands, accustomed to the rough texture of fishing nets and agricultural tools, innocently passed over birth certificates, local identification cards, and the crucial 9-digit numerical sequences that the federal government used to track human existence. They surrendered the very keys to their digital identities, believing they were placing them into the hands of a trusted friend. Once she possessed this critical information, the door to her home closed, the friendly facade vanished, and the systematic exploitation began. The interior of her residence was transformed into a clandestine manufacturing facility dedicated entirely to the production of fictitious realities. The raw data she had extracted from her neighbors was fed into a computer system, where it was stripped of its humanity and reduced to mere variables in a complex algorithmic equation of theft. She established a sprawling network of phantom corporations, fabricating business entities with official-sounding names and registered addresses spread across the continental United States. These were ghost companies, existing nowhere but in the digital memory of her hard drive, yet they formed the essential backbone of her scheme. With the fake employers established, she then proceeded to draft her victims into a phantom workforce. Using the stolen personal information, she meticulously filled out thousands of fields on federal tax forms, creating an entirely alternate universe for the residents of the island. In this fabricated reality, the impoverished fishermen and local laborers were no longer living in the tropical heat of the Pacific. On paper, they had been magically transported thousands of miles away, integrated into the bustling economies of distant, unfamiliar states. She assigned them grueling, high-paying jobs in the freezing, snow-covered expanses of Alaska, the industrial centers of the Midwest, and the sprawling urban landscapes of the East Coast. The sheer geographical absurdity of the claim was staggering. She was telling the federal government that a community of tropical islanders, many of whom had never boarded a commercial aircraft or experienced temperatures below 70 degrees, were simultaneously employed in heavy industry near the Arctic Circle, earning substantial wages and dutifully paying their mainland taxes. The core mechanism of the fraud relied on a massive, calculated lie regarding tax withholdings. On every forged document, IFOPO reported that these phantom employers had withheld exorbitant amounts of income tax from the victims' supposed wages. She inflated the numbers to the absolute threshold of believability, ensuring that the forms indicated a massive overpayment to the federal government. The logic she presented to the automated systems of the Internal Revenue Service was simple and compelling. These hardworking citizens had paid far too much throughout the fiscal year, and they were legally entitled to a substantial refund. She manipulated the complex formulas of deductions, credits, and withholdings with the expertise of a seasoned accountant, ensuring that every single forged return resulted in a maximum payout. She was exploiting a fundamental vulnerability in the architecture of massive governmental bureaucracies. The Internal Revenue Service, tasked with processing hundreds of millions of returns every single year, relied heavily on automated systems to manage the unimaginable volume of data. The agency simply did not have the human resources to manually investigate the geographical logic of every single document submitted. The system was designed to detect discrepancies between an individual's tax return and the information provided by their employer. But IFOPO had eliminated this fail-safe by controlling both sides of the equation. She was the fake employee submitting the claim, and she was the fake employer verifying the fabricated income and withholdings. Because her victims had never filed taxes before, there was no historical data to contradict her claims. To the automated servers in Washington, the paperwork appeared pristine, structurally sound, and mathematically flawless. The system could not see the palm trees or the corrugated metal roofs. It only saw the numbers, and the numbers demanded a payout. The transition from digital manipulation to physical wealth was a masterclass in illicit logistics. The federal government, trusting the flawless paperwork, began to issue the requested refunds. But the money, of course, was not routed to the impoverished victims whose identities had been used to secure it. IFOPO had carefully directed the flow of capital into accounts and addresses that she wholly controlled. The physical manifestation of her crime began to arrive in the mail, day after day, month after month. The distinctive, official envelopes of the Department of the Treasury became a regular delivery to her operation. Inside were official government checks, printed on secure paper, bearing watermarks and the authoritative red stamped insignias of the Internal Revenue Service. Each check represented thousands of dollars, a massive transfer of wealth triggered by a few keystrokes in a dark room. The accumulation of the stolen wealth was staggering. She sat at her desk, surrounded by the physical evidence of her successful deception. Her hands, which had previously typed out the false narratives of her neighbors' lives, were now occupied with a different task. She began the process of converting the official government paper into untraceable liquid assets. The checks were deposited, the funds laundered through various channels, and eventually reduced to cold, hard currency. The imagery of the fraud reached its climax in the quiet solitude of her office. She sat in the dim light, physically counting thick, heavy stacks of United States dollars. The crisp texture of the bills, the distinct smell of printed money, provided a sensory confirmation of her triumph. The digital counter on her computer screen, which tracked the total amount of refunds successfully claimed, steadily climbed higher and higher, mirroring the growing stacks of currency on her desk. It bypassed hundreds of thousands of dollars, pushing relentlessly toward a figure that defied comprehension in such a small, economically isolated community. The total sum eventually eclipsed the $1 million mark. Over $1 million of federal funds, successfully extracted from the United States Treasury, had flowed directly into her possession. It was an empire of illicit wealth constructed entirely upon a foundation of absolute betrayal. Yet, this monumental financial success carried an inherent, invisible weight. She had generated a fortune, but it was a fortune tethered to a massive, sprawling lie. Every single dollar in those stacks was directly linked to a forged signature, a stolen identity, and a fabricated reality. While she counted her millions in the security of her home, the system she had manipulated was beginning to permanently record the fraudulent data. She had successfully fooled the machines, but in doing so, she had fundamentally altered the official, permanent records of over 200 innocent people. The government now believed that these impoverished islanders were wealthy, tax-evading laborers scattered across the continent. She had unleashed a bureaucratic leviathan, entirely oblivious to the catastrophic damage it was about to inflict upon the very neighbors she had pretended to help. The money was safe in her hands for the moment, but the invisible machinery of consequence had already been set into motion, and the quiet, isolated paradise of the island was standing directly in its path, completely unaware of the approaching devastation. While the architect of this massive deception sat comfortably in her dimly lit office, securely counting the illicit wealth generated by her fictitious enterprise, the slow and grinding machinery of the United States federal government finally began to catch up to the anomaly. The Internal Revenue Service operates as an entity of absolute, unfeeling mathematics, relying on vast arrays of servers located thousands of miles away from the warm shores of the Pacific. Inside these cooled server rooms, algorithms designed to detect patterns of financial irregularity began to flag a highly suspicious concentration of data. It was not the staggering dollar amounts that initially triggered the internal alarms, but rather the structural identicality of the submissions. Hundreds of tax returns were suddenly flowing from the exact same isolated zip code, all claiming the exact same convoluted narrative of mainland employment, excessive withholdings, and maximum refunds. To the digital sentinels of the federal government, this was a glaring statistical impossibility. The system recognized the anomaly, but a computer program possesses no capacity for nuance, empathy, or geographical context. It could not deduce that a single mastermind was orchestrating this localized spike in activity. The automated logic simply concluded that a massive, coordinated effort of tax evasion and fraud was originating from a specific group of individuals living on the island. Consequently, the colossal investigative weight of the federal government was mobilized, but its trajectory was fundamentally flawed from the very beginning. The crosshairs of justice were not aimed at the shadowy orchestrator hidden behind a glowing monitor, but rather at the names printed clearly on the fabricated documents. The investigative mandate was issued, and the resulting bureaucratic storm began its rapid, unstoppable descent toward the innocent, completely oblivious residents of the island. The transition from digital suspicion in Washington to physical consequence in American Samoa was abrupt and jarring, fundamentally altering the atmosphere of the tranquil territory. The vibrant, sunlit reality of the island seemed to drain away, replaced by an oppressive, suffocating gray as the physical embodiment of mainland authority arrived on their shores. Sleek, dark federal vehicles, a stark and alien sight against the backdrop of dirt roads and simple corrugated metal structures, rolled slowly into the heart of the coastal villages. The heavy tires crunched against the crushed coral, a sound that signaled the permanent end of the community's innocent isolation. Special agents, dressed in severe, dark attire that contrasted violently with the tropical heat and the casual, weathered clothing of the locals, stepped out of their vehicles. They moved with the rigid, purposeful efficiency of mainland law enforcement, carrying thick folders filled with official indictments, audit notices, and demands for immediate restitution. They did not arrive as impartial investigators seeking the truth of a complex situation. They arrived as debt collectors and criminal interrogators, fully convinced that the impoverished people standing before them were part of a sophisticated, sprawling syndicate of financial criminals. The villagers, who had spent their morning casting nets into the sea and tending to their modest daily needs, simply stopped and stared in profound bewilderment as this imposing force descended upon their homes. The protective bubble of their geographic isolation had burst entirely, exposing them to a punitive system they lacked the cultural and linguistic tools to even begin to understand. The sheer terror of this collision between two entirely incompatible worlds was most painfully evident in the individual confrontations that began to unfold outside the modest thatch and metal homes. A towering federal agent approached a local fisherman, a man whose hands were scarred by years of hauling heavy lines and whose face bore the deep, permanent lines of a lifetime spent under the equatorial sun. The agent presented a dense stack of official documents bearing the intimidating official seals of the Internal Revenue Service and the Department of Justice. The fisherman, possessing only a rudimentary grasp of the English language and absolutely no comprehension of mainland tax law, stared blankly at the pages thrust toward him. The documents accused him of living in a state he had never visited, working for a corporation he had never heard of, and owing the federal government a sum of money so astronomically large that it exceeded the combined generational wealth of his entire extended family. He tried to communicate, his voice trembling with a mixture of profound confusion and mounting panic, but the language barrier stood as an impenetrable wall between his innocence and the agent's absolute mandate. The investigator, trained to view hesitation and confusion as primary indicators of guilt, maintained a posture of relentless authority, gesturing firmly to the signature line at the bottom of a terrifyingly complex legal form. The fisherman, overwhelmed by the sheer presence of state power and terrified of the implied consequences of disobedience, slowly took the pen. His calloused, shaking hand awkwardly traced his name onto the document, unwittingly acknowledging receipt of a financial death sentence he could not even read. In that singular, devastating moment, a man who had lived his entire life in honest poverty was officially documented as a severe economic threat to the United States government. This localized tragedy replicated itself hundreds of times across the small island, creating an epidemic of unwarranted legal terror that swept through the indigenous population. The operational protocol of the federal agency dictated that the individuals named on the fraudulent returns were the primary suspects, placing the absolute burden of proof entirely upon the victims themselves. These families, whose daily existence revolved around the simple, immediate challenges of securing food and maintaining their modest shelters, suddenly found themselves blacklisted by the most powerful financial institution on the planet. They were officially classified as federal criminals, subjected to relentless, invasive interrogations regarding vast sums of money they had never seen and complex schemes they possessed no capacity to understand. The bureaucratic machinery demanded documentation, verified alibis, and extensive financial records that simply did not exist in a community that operated largely outside the bounds of modern corporate banking. When they could not produce the required evidence to clear their names, the system automatically escalated its punitive measures without hesitation. The government initiated formal proceedings to garnish whatever meager wages they earned from local labor, placing severe legal liens on their modest properties and constantly threatening them with severe criminal prosecution. They were trapped in a dark, bureaucratic nightmare, forced to defend themselves against a meticulously fabricated reality that existed entirely on servers thousands of miles away from their physical reality. The profound injustice of the situation was staggering, creating a painful paradox where the true architect of the fraud was spending the stolen millions on personal luxuries, while the people she had exploited were left to face the terrifying prospect of federal prison sentences for crimes they did not even know how to commit. The psychological devastation inflicted upon the community was absolute, irreversible, and deeply traumatic. The fundamental fabric of the village, which had been woven together over generations through mutual trust, shared hardship, and communal support, was violently torn apart by the sudden influx of federal scrutiny. The quiet, peaceful rhythm of island life was completely shattered, instantly replaced by an atmosphere of chronic paranoia, deep suspicion, and overwhelming collective despair. Behind the thin walls of their homes, families huddled together in a state of paralyzing fear, weeping over official letters filled with red ink and aggressive legal jargon that promised complete financial and personal ruin. The elders of the community, who had always served as the respected pillars of strength and traditional wisdom, found themselves entirely powerless in the face of this invisible administrative violence. They could not protect their children from the threatening letters arriving in the mail, nor could they negotiate with the cold, unyielding representatives of the mainland government who refused to understand their way of life. The profound sense of safety that had always defined their isolated existence evaporated completely, leaving behind a constant, suffocating dread that colored every interaction. Every time an unfamiliar vehicle approached the perimeter of the village, a massive wave of panic would ripple through the community, as residents deeply feared the arrival of more agents, more gruff interrogations, and the very real possibility of being taken away in heavy steel handcuffs. They had become prisoners in their own tropical paradise, weighed down by the invisible but unbreakable chains of a massive, fabricated debt that they could never hope to repay. The investigations conducted by the agents were inherently, structurally biased by the meticulous paperwork that Corina Ifopo had so carefully forged over the past 2 years. When the mainland agents looked directly at the islanders, they did not see vulnerable victims of a sophisticated identity theft ring. They saw the masterminds of a localized, highly coordinated fraud syndicate. This profound cognitive dissonance shaped and poisoned every single interaction between the authorities and the locals. The investigators relentlessly asked highly technical questions about routing numbers, offshore bank accounts, and complex corporate shell structures. The victims, in response, could only offer blank stares and their simple, handwritten ledgers of local fishing yields or small agricultural sales, which only served to frustrate the federal agents further. This failure to communicate was not merely a linguistic issue, it was a complete and total collapse of shared reality. The mainland investigators possessed a rigid worldview defined purely by digital transactions, tax brackets, and strict legal accountability, while the islanders lived in a highly tangible world of physical labor, immediate survival, and tight community ties. The federal agents interpreted the villagers' genuine inability to explain the complex tax filings as a form of willful, malicious obstruction, further cementing their deeply held belief in the islanders' inherent guilt. The interrogations were incredibly grueling, slowly stripping the victims of their personal dignity and forcing them to repeatedly confess their utter ignorance to stern-faced strangers who simply refused to believe a word they were saying. The emotional toll of being officially branded a liar, a tax evader, and a thief by the highest law enforcement authorities of the land began to completely crush the collective spirit of the village. Men who had proudly and independently provided for their families through hard physical labor felt completely emasculated by their total inability to defend their homes from this unprecedented bureaucratic invasion. Women wept in pure frustration as they desperately tried to comfort young children who did not understand why their parents were suddenly so frightened of the mail carrier or the sight of a dark car. The very concept of justice had been entirely inverted on the island, weaponized against the innocent by a mainland system that was too large, too distant, and too rigidly automated to recognize the glaring, tragic absurdity of the situation it had inadvertently created. The cruel irony of the entire tragedy was that the very mechanism explicitly designed to protect the financial integrity of the federal treasury was actively, systematically destroying the lives of the most marginalized and defenseless citizens under its jurisdiction. The agency, in its blind, relentless pursuit of the stolen funds, operated with a ruthless, mechanical efficiency that left absolutely no room for the basic presumption of innocence. The official notices of deficiency piled up relentlessly in the modest homes, the outstanding theoretical balances accumulating astronomical financial penalties and interest with every passing day. For a community that survived solely on a fragile, localized economy, these theoretical debts represented an impossible burden, a financial death sentence that would hang over their heads for the rest of their natural lives. The fear of federal prison was a tangible, suffocating presence in the humid air, a dark cloud that obscured the vibrant tropical sun and poisoned their daily routines. They vividly imagined being forcibly torn from their families, shipped across the vast ocean to cold, concrete cells on the mainland, uniquely punished for the insatiable greed of a woman they had mistakenly, tragically trusted. The island, once a beautiful sanctuary of peace and simplicity, had permanently become a site of profound psychological torture, a place where completely innocent people were actively forced to pay the ultimate emotional and financial price for a devastating crime that had been conceived, flawlessly executed, and entirely profited from by a ruthless predator hiding silently in their own backyard. The inevitable collapse of Karina Ifopo's carefully constructed house of cards did not begin with a grand moral awakening or a sudden confession, but rather with the inherent, crushing weight of the bureaucracy she had sought to exploit. Despite her surgical precision in manipulating the individual tax returns of her neighbors, she had ultimately created a data footprint that was simply too large and too consistent to remain buried beneath the noise of federal processing. The very efficiency that had allowed her to siphon over $1 million out of the United States Treasury became the ultimate catalyst for her undoing. The Internal Revenue Service, though initially misled, possessed the patience and the immense, unyielding resources of the federal government. Once the agency moved past its initial flawed assumption that the islanders were the primary architects of the fraud, its specialized investigative units began to conduct a systematic, deep-dive analysis of the digital ledger. They stopped looking at the individual returns in isolation and began to view them as a singular, cohesive cluster. The patterns that emerged were far too distinct to be coincidental. Every single fraudulent return, regardless of which victim's identity was utilized, shared the exact same digital fingerprint. They were submitted from the same range of IP addresses, utilized identical, repetitive wording in the descriptions of the phantom occupations, and, most damningly, requested that the resulting funds be funneled into a highly centralized web of bank accounts that were ultimately tied back to the same physical location in American Samoa. The algorithmic facade that Ifopo had so confidently constructed began to shatter under the weight of this overwhelming, interconnected evidence. The federal investigators were no longer chasing hundreds of different suspects. They were closing in on a singular point of origin. The investigation, now properly oriented, began to pick up a cold, relentless momentum that could no longer be checked by the silence or the isolation of the island. The agents, armed with a newfound, correct understanding of the situation, traded their heavy, accusatory posture toward the victims for a focused, tactical approach aimed at the source of the data. They began to meticulously trace the digital pathways of the stolen money, peeling back the layers of deception that Ifopo had installed to obscure her tracks. Each fake employer, each fabricated business entity, and each offshore shell account was systematically dismantled and investigated. The complexity of her scheme, which had initially served as her strongest defense, now served as the primary evidence of her premeditated, extensive criminal intent. The federal government, once it realized that it had been played, responded with the full, unchecked force of its investigative capacity. The FBI, recognizing that this case had escalated from simple tax fraud to a massive, systemic violation of federal law involving the coordinated, large-scale theft of identities, officially joined the investigation. The coordination between the tax investigators and the federal agents was seamless. They moved with a level of quiet, professional intensity that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic, panicked environment that had been inflicted upon the islanders. The net was tightening around the home of the 54-year-old woman, and she was, for the first time, completely oblivious to the reality that the very systems she had manipulated were now the instruments of her own capture. Inside her office, Karina Ifopo continued to operate with a delusional sense of security, convinced that her meticulous attention to detail would keep the authorities permanently locked in a state of confusion. She spent her days refining her lies, adjusting the margins of her fabrications, and basking in the false sense of omnipotence that her stolen millions provided. She was entirely unaware that the agents were no longer investigating her victims. They were monitoring her digital movements in real time. They were observing the cadence of her keystrokes, mapping the geographical origin of her submissions, and confirming the physical location of the bank accounts that received the Treasury funds. The arrogance required to believe that one could successfully defraud the most powerful financial institution in the world from a small, isolated room in the Pacific for 2 years without being detected had begun to warp her perspective. She stopped seeing herself as a criminal and started believing that she had effectively outsmarted the law. This hubris, however, was the ultimate, fatal oversight of her entire campaign. It caused her to let her guard down, to become repetitive, and to rely on the same established patterns that the federal algorithms were specifically designed to flag. She had built a trap for the government, but in her arrogance, she had inadvertently walked into a far more complex and inescapable snare of her own making. The climax of the investigation arrived with the chilling, surgical precision that characterizes federal law enforcement operations. There was no theatrical standoff, no dramatic chase across the tropical landscape. Instead, the final phase of the operation was an exercise in absolute, overwhelming authority. On the day of the apprehension, the quiet of the village was interrupted not by the confused, aggressive visits of tax auditors, but by the coordinated, silent arrival of specialized tactical teams. They moved with a fluidity that was entirely absent from the earlier, fumbling attempts at investigation. Every exit to the office was secured. Every digital communication line was severed, and the agents approached the front door with the calm confidence of individuals who held all the cards. When the agents 100% confirmed that the individual inside was indeed the primary suspect, they executed the final warrant. The transition from the safety of the interior to the reality of the exterior was instantaneous. The agents swept into the office with the force of an incoming tide, their movements synchronized and efficient. Karina Ifopo, who had spent the last 2 years orchestrating a massive, complex, and invisible crime, was physically frozen, caught in the center of her own web, with the evidence of her deception spread out across her desk like a morbid game of solitaire. The scene within the office during the raid was a vivid, physical representation of the deception that had ruined so many lives. The agents found the office in a state of clinical, organized chaos. Multiple high-capacity computers were running simultaneously, their monitors glowing with the active, open files of dozens of unsuspecting residents. Sheets of W-2 forms, some half-printed and others already signed with the forged credentials of the victims, were strewn across every available surface. The printer, which had been the primary engine of her crime, was still warm to the touch, its mechanical arm still vibrating with the latent energy of its recent tasks. The agents did not need to ask questions. The physical proof of her guilt was so extensive and so meticulously documented that it functioned as a self-contained, undeniable confession. As the agents systematically cataloged the digital and physical evidence, they uncovered hard drives packed with the sensitive personal data of hundreds of people, organized in clear, callous folders. They found the ledgers of the bank accounts that had received the Treasury payments, the records of the money laundering attempts, and the detailed notes she had kept on how to bypass various security protocols. Every single piece of evidence was meticulously labeled and packed into secure containers. For the first time, the narrative of the crime was being reclaimed by the authorities, and the false reality that Ifopo had been projecting onto the federal government was being forcibly overwritten by the stark, tangible truth of her actions. The apprehension itself was a moment of absolute, crushing finality. As the agents placed the steel handcuffs onto her wrists, the sound of the metal snapping shut served as the definitive, resonant end to the 2-year reign of her fraudulent enterprise. The woman who had treated the lives of her neighbors like disposable data points was finally forced to confront the reality of her own individual existence within the reach of the law. She was led out of her home and toward the waiting federal vehicles, her face a mask of cold, defiant silence that never wavered, even as she was driven away from the island and toward the mainland judicial system. There were no outbursts, no final pleas for understanding, only the heavy, oppressive silence of a predator who realized that the game she had been playing for so long had finally, definitively run its course. For the residents of the village, watching the departure from the safety of their porches, it was a moment of profound, confusing relief. They did not fully understand the technical, complex mechanics of what had occurred, but they understood the visual weight of the agents, the sight of the woman in handcuffs, and the clear, final sign that the nightmare that had been crushing their lives was being removed from their community. The cloud of fear that had hovered over their homes began to dissipate, leaving behind a profound sense of exhaustion and a deep, haunting awareness of how quickly their innocence could be weaponized against them. As the federal team departed with their prisoner and their extensive collection of evidence, the office was left behind as a hollowed-out, stagnant shell. The monitors were black, the printers were silent, and the documents that had once served as instruments of mass theft were now merely paper, to be archived in the cold, unfeeling basements of federal courthouses. The total destruction of the infrastructure of the crime was absolute. The agents had cut off the supply of the fraud, seized the assets, and arrested the architect, but they had also left behind a massive, complicated wreckage that would require years of intense, careful effort to resolve. The legal status of the 200 victims remained compromised, their names still tied to the massive, fraudulent filings that had been processed by the IRS systems. While the arrest of Ifopo provided the necessary proof for the eventual exoneration of the neighbors, it did not immediately erase the systemic, institutional damage that had been done to their credit, their legal standing, and their personal sense of security. The investigation had reached its climax, the primary target had been apprehended, and the criminal operation had been permanently dismantled, but the long, exhausting process of repairing the shattered lives of the innocent victims was only just beginning. The residents of the island had been saved from the predator in their midst, but they were still haunted by the realization that their names had been turned into government records of crime, and that the stain of the fraud would take a very, very long time to fade. The island returned to its slow, rhythmic pace, but the silence that followed was different. It was the heavy, contemplative silence of a community that had stared directly into the digital heart of the modern world and had seen, with terrifying clarity, the monstrous capacity for exploitation that it held. The judicial proceedings that followed the apprehension of Corina Ifopo were a sobering, clinical, and exhaustive process that mirrored the cold precision of the crime itself. Once the federal government had successfully secured the evidence and dismantled the clandestine infrastructure within her office, the focus shifted from the investigation to the courtroom. The process of bringing her to justice was not merely a matter of proving guilt, it was a necessary, formal undoing of the thousands of lies she had woven into the federal records. Throughout the pretrial hearings, the courtroom became a stage where the stark, tangible reality of the victimized residents was contrasted against the calculated, meticulous manipulation of the defendant. Prosecutors laid out a narrative that was devastating in its simplicity and clarity, presenting the mountain of forensic evidence gathered from her home as an irrefutable testament to a sustained, multi-year campaign of exploitation. Each forged document, each Dr. W-2 form, and each fraudulent tax return was analyzed and presented, mapping out the precise mechanics of how she had weaponized the identities of the most vulnerable people in her community. The courtroom, characterized by its sterile environment, harsh lighting, and the measured, somber pace of legal discourse, stood in complete opposition to the tropical, intimate, and often chaotic reality of the island that had suffered the consequences of her greed. The proceedings were not solely focused on the condemnation of the perpetrator, but also on the painstaking, complex restoration of the victims' reputations. Every single file that had been flagged by the IRS, every lien that had been placed on their property, and every criminal notice that had been sent to their homes had to be individually, formally corrected within the federal system. This was an arduous task, requiring the victims to participate in a series of legal inquiries that, while necessary, frequently re-traumatized them as they were forced to recount their ignorance of the fraud and their lack of involvement in any financial malpractice. They sat in the courtroom or participated through legal representatives, witnessing the formal, official admission of the crimes that had upended their lives. The sight of Corina Ifopo sitting at the defense table, largely impassive and detached, was a final, bitter pill for the community to swallow. She was the one who had walked among them, who had shared their communal spaces, and who had feigned the role of a helpful neighbor, all while systematically drafting the documents that threatened their freedom and their dignity. Seeing her formally stripped of her autonomy and held accountable by the very federal system she had mocked served as the central point of the justice that the community had been yearning for, yet it could not replace the lost sense of security that had been eroded by the entire ordeal. As the testimony progressed, the scope of the deception became even more pronounced. The evidence revealed not just a single, isolated criminal act, but a series of interconnected betrayals that reached into the core of the community's trust. The defense, in their attempts to mitigate the severity of the charges, faced the insurmountable barrier of the sheer volume and intentionality of the fraud. There were no extenuating circumstances that could justify the targeting of individuals who were so clearly defenseless. The prosecutors emphasized the long-term, calculated nature of the operation, pointing to the specific, predatory methods IFOPO used to target those with the least capacity to defend themselves. The trial underscored a fundamental, painful lesson for the community. In a world increasingly governed by digital data, trust can be a vulnerability, and the information one holds dear is often the exact currency used by those who wish to do harm. The courtroom served as a venue for the official recognition of this truth, transforming the private, localized suffering of the islanders into a matter of public, national record. It was a formal, institutional validation of the fact that these people were not criminals, but the victims of a cruel and sophisticated theft of their digital lives. When the verdict was finally reached, it brought a heavy, profound sense of closure that had been absent for the duration of the investigation. The conviction of Corina IFOPO on the numerous counts of federal fraud, identity theft, and money laundering was the final, structural resolution to the legal crisis. The sentencing phase, which followed, allowed for a measure of public acknowledgement of the destruction she had caused. The judge, in delivering the sentence, spoke to the egregious breach of trust and the irreparable damage inflicted upon the innocent residents whose lives had been hijacked. The duration of her prison sentence, long and severe, was intended to reflect not just the loss of the federal treasury's funds, but the calculated exploitation of the most vulnerable citizens under the protection of the state. It was a victory for the rule of law, confirming that the bureaucratic systems, while flawed and slow to react, were ultimately capable of identifying and punishing those who subverted them for personal gain. However, for the people of American Samoa, the sentencing was less about the specific number of years she would spend behind bars and more about the symbolic restoration of their own integrity. It signaled the end of the fear that had been looming over their heads, the removal of the false, criminal identities that had been attached to their names, and the return, however slow, to their normal lives. The aftermath of the trial was a long, complex period of recovery for the families who had been swept up in the fraud. The government, now fully cognizant of the reality of the situation, began the tedious process of clearing the records of the victims. Each individual had to be formally cleared of the liens, the debt notices, and the tax penalties that had been erroneously levied against them. This required continuous, often frustrating communication with agencies that operated at a massive scale and struggled to accommodate the unique circumstances of the islanders. The trauma of the experience, the constant threat of legal action, and the deep, unsettling feeling of being labeled a criminal by an authority one did not even understand, left a permanent scar on the consciousness of the community. They had discovered that their isolation, once a source of comfort and peace, was also a source of deep, systemic vulnerability. The trial had forced them to engage with a world they had previously remained detached from, and in that engagement, they had learned a difficult, life-altering lesson about the dangers of modern digital life. They returned to their homes and their daily routines, but the innocence that had characterized their lives before 2014 was permanently gone, replaced by a cautious, weary awareness of the potential for harm that existed beyond their shores. Throughout the process, the image of Corina IFOPO standing before the court, stripped of her agency and forced to answer for her crimes, remained a resonant, powerful symbol. She was the architect of their despair, the physical manifestation of the invisible danger that had compromised their names, their property, and their peace of mind. Her confinement did not erase the 2 years of fear or the lasting damage done to the communal trust that had once defined the village, but it did provide a necessary, official end to the nightmare. The legal system, in its cold and calculated way, had eventually served the purpose for which it was designed, providing a mechanism for restitution and the restoration of order in a situation that had been defined by chaos and deception. The records that she had so carefully forged were finally invalidated, the fraudulent debt was erased, and the victims were, in the eyes of the law, officially innocent once again. The trial, therefore, was not just about the incarceration of an individual, but about the formal, systemic purging of the lies that had infested their community. It was a necessary, brutal, and ultimately constructive process that allowed the people of the island to move forward, knowing that the specific threat had been eliminated and that the law, however slowly and imperfectly, had aligned itself with the truth of their situation. As the dust settled on the legal proceedings, the village of American Samoa began the difficult work of healing. The shadow of the fraud, which had once been a dark and persistent presence in every conversation, began to slowly recede, though it never fully vanished. The community had survived a modern, digital catastrophe that had been entirely unique in its history, and they had come out the other side fundamentally altered. They now understood the importance of the documents they had once innocently surrendered, the value of the digital data that was linked to their names, and the reality that their isolated, tropical sanctuary was inextricably connected to the vast, complex, and often indifferent world of mainland finance. The memory of the trial and the sentencing of Corina Ifopo would always remain a part of their collective history, a dark chapter that served as both a traumatic lesson and a testament to their resilience. The process had not just been an exercise in punishment, it had been an essential, necessary path toward justice, enabling the victims to reclaim their identities, their reputations, and their futures from the cold, artificial control of a criminal who had mistaken their vulnerability for a permanent state of victimhood. The formal end of the trial, and the finality of the verdict, marked the moment when the island could finally stop looking toward the mainland with a sense of dread and begin to rebuild the quiet, peaceful life they had always known, fortified by the hard-won wisdom of their survival. The dust has long since settled on the tranquil shores of American Samoa, yet the resonance of the deception remains a permanent, invisible fixture in the collective memory of the island. The case of Corina Ifopo stands as a stark, chilling monument to the intersection of ancient, communal trust and the cold, unyielding mechanics of the modern digital world. When we reflect on this episode, we are not merely recounting a historical instance of financial fraud. We are witnessing the fundamental transformation of a society that was forced to confront the harsh reality of its own vulnerability. The devastation was not limited to the millions of dollars siphoned from the federal treasury or the thousands of hours wasted by investigators and legal professionals. The true tragedy, the one that lingers in the quiet conversations held on porches at dusk, is the profound loss of an unburdened existence. Before the fraud, the residents lived with a sense of security rooted in their physical reality, a world where one's reputation was built on years of shared experience and neighborly kindness. That sense of safety was shattered by a woman who understood that in the 21st century, a person's life can be reduced to a collection of data points, and that those data points, once compromised, can be manipulated to create a completely false existence that carries real, often devastating consequences. The trauma was not just the fear of prison or the threat of financial ruin. It was the realization that the world beyond the horizon was not just distant, but actively predatory, capable of reaching into their modest homes to extract their very identities for profit. In the aftermath, the islanders have been forced to navigate the difficult process of reconciliation with a modern world that they never asked to be a part of. The legal system eventually cleared their names and restored their records, but it could not restore the fundamental, naive trust that once defined their social fabric. They have become guarded, their interactions now colored by a cautious awareness that was entirely absent before the arrival of the federal agents. This is perhaps the most lasting and most tragic legacy of Ifopo's crime. She did not just steal money, she stole a piece of the communal spirit that made the island a sanctuary. Every time a new official document arrives, or every time a government representative sets foot on the territory, there is a flicker of the old dread, a residual echo of the days when their names were used as weapons against them. They have been forced to become literate in the language of bureaucracy, to understand the intricacies of identification, and to maintain a vigilant, defensive posture against the very systems they were previously exempt from. This transition from a life of natural, unexamined simplicity to a life of guarded, informed awareness is the true price paid by the community, a price that no federal restitution check could ever hope to cover. The story of the fraud also serves as a haunting, cautionary tale regarding the escalating fragility of identity in our interconnected global landscape. Ifopo's success, however temporary, was proof of a systemic failure that persists far beyond the borders of American Samoa. She exploited the cracks in an automated, massive-scale administrative infrastructure that prioritizes efficiency over the human element. By weaponizing the fact that the federal government views its citizens primarily through the lens of digital data, She exposed a structural weakness that remains a persistent risk for any community that finds itself on the periphery of the technological age. The fact that an individual operating from a small office in the Pacific could successfully deceive the Internal Revenue Service for years is a sobering indictment of how detached the modern state has become from the tangible realities of the people it governs. It forces us to ask critical questions about the nature of the social contract in the digital era. What protections exist for those who are invisible to the algorithms? And how can a system that relies on pure data ever be truly, just if it lacks the capacity to see the human faces behind the numbers? The residents of the island were not merely victims of a criminal, they were victims of a system that was fundamentally ill-equipped to recognize their humanity until it was almost too late. Looking back, the case of the Samoa tax fraud acts as a mirror, reflecting our own collective dependencies and the dangers of our total migration into the digital realm. We live in an age where our identities, our histories, and our futures are increasingly hosted on servers that we do not control, governed by codes we do not write, and processed by systems we do not understand. Ifopo saw this world not as a source of progress, but as a fertile ground for exploitation. She demonstrated, with terrifying clarity, that the more we digitize our lives, the more we open ourselves to the possibility of a total, fabricated takeover of our personal stories. Her actions were an extreme manifestation of a risk that is now omnipresent. While most people will never experience a fraud of this magnitude, the underlying threat, the possibility of having one's identity mismanaged, stolen, or weaponized, is a constant, background noise in the lives of millions. The islanders were, in a way, the canaries in the coal mine, experiencing the full, unfiltered impact of a digital future that the rest of the world is still slowly, and perhaps dangerously, sleepwalking into. Their resilience in the face of this intrusion is commendable, but their story serves as a sharp, necessary reminder that our digital footprint is not just a record of our actions. It is a point of failure that we must defend with the same vigilance we apply to our physical homes. As the years continue to pass, the memory of the crime will slowly fade into the oral history of the island, transitioning from a lived, traumatic reality to a cautionary narrative passed down to the next generation. It will join the stories of storms, tides, and external incursions that have shaped the territory's resilience over the centuries. Yet, the lessons learned from the struggle are universal and timeless. Justice, in the end, was a necessary and important conclusion, but it was not a return to the state of grace that existed before the crime. True justice, if we are to define it in the context of the victims, would have been the prevention of the crime itself, a recognition by the state of its duty to protect those who are most vulnerable to its own administrative machinery. Until such protections are deeply ingrained in the architecture of our institutions, the possibility of a repeat occurrence remains a lingering, undeniable fact. The case forces us to move beyond the binary of criminal and victim and into a deeper, more uncomfortable space where we must acknowledge our shared responsibility for the systems we have built and the ways in which we allow those systems to treat our neighbors. The ordeal has left the community with a hardened, sharper perspective on the modern world, a perspective that is both a badge of honor and a symbol of what was lost. They have moved on, as all resilient peoples do, but they do so with a profound, internal awareness that their paradise is no longer an island in the literal or the metaphorical sense. They are part of the vast, complex, and interconnected tapestry of human experience, exposed to the same predatory forces that haunt every corner of the planet. They have learned that freedom is not just the absence of outside control, but the active, constant defense of one's own existence in the eyes of the institutions that hold the power to define it. They carry the weight of their experience with a quiet, dignified grace, using the memory of the ordeal as a guide for how to navigate the future. They are no longer the innocent villagers who believed in the inherent goodness of a neighbor, nor are they the unsuspecting victims of a distant government. They are something new, a community that has survived the worst of the digital age and has chosen to keep its soul intact. The story of their struggle will persist, a testament to the fact that while technology can be used to construct a million-dollar lie, nothing can ultimately replace the truth of human experience or the resilience of a community that refuses to be defined by the corruption of its own history. The final word on this case belongs not to the prosecutor, nor the judge, nor the criminal herself, but to the residents of American Samoa who continue to live, work, and dream in the face of a reality that tried, and failed, to turn their names into hollow shadows for the sake of profit. They remain the living, breathing, and enduring truth, a constant reminder that the most sophisticated systems in the world are nothing compared to the quiet, persistent reality of a human life, lived with integrity, connection, and an unwavering commitment to the community that sustains it, even when the world outside tries to break that foundation down. The conclusion of the story of the American Samoa tax fraud does not reside in the sterile, air-conditioned confines of a courtroom or in the definitive, cold pronouncement of a judge's sentence, but rather in the persistent, evolving reality of the islanders themselves. To truly understand the gravity of what happened between 2014 and 2016, one must step away from the analytical framework of criminal justice and return to the physical geography of the territory. The landscape has not changed. The tides continue their relentless rhythm, and the sun rises each morning to illuminate the same vibrant, green hills and the same weathered, corrugated metal roofs. Yet, the social architecture of the villages has undergone a fundamental, permanent shift that no legal proceeding could ever fully reverse. The collective experience of the community has become a part of their cultural DNA, a shared trauma that has matured into a cautious, sophisticated wisdom. They have been forced, by the sheer brutality of the betrayal, to adapt to the realities of a globalized, digital world that had once seemed like an alien, distant abstraction. This adaptation is not a sign of defeat, but a testament to a unique, indomitable form of resilience that is specific to those who have faced the absolute worst of what modernity has to offer and have chosen, quite simply, to endure. In the years following the resolution of the legal crisis, the community has seen an internal strengthening of its social ties, a defensive fortification of the very trust that was so cruelly manipulated by Corina Ifopo. They have instituted informal, community-led initiatives to educate one another about the nature of personal documentation, the necessity of digital security, and the dangers of allowing outsiders to handle their sensitive, foundational paperwork. There is a newfound, collective awareness that their names and their identities are not merely traditional markers of family lineage, but are, in the eyes of the modern state, valuable assets that require careful protection and constant surveillance. This is not a transition that happened overnight, nor was it one that was welcomed with open arms. It was a painful, exhausting labor, requiring the elders of the villages to reconcile their traditional wisdom with the jarring, technical realities of the 21st century. They have learned to balance the warmth of their hospitality with a healthy, necessary skepticism, recognizing that the very values that have sustained them for generations, the values of openness and mutual aid, can be weaponized by those with sufficient malice and technical sophistication. This evolution is the ultimate, quiet victory over the perpetrator. She sought to isolate them in their own helplessness, but in doing so, she inadvertently catalyzed the development of a more robust, informed, and vigilant community. Furthermore, the case has left an indelible mark on the broader perception of how federal authorities engage with vulnerable, geographically isolated populations. While the initial response of the government was a failure of monumental proportions, the subsequent, forced engagement with the realities of American Samoa has led to a slow, incremental, and necessary change in bureaucratic policy. The incident has served as a powerful, uncomfortable case study within the Internal Revenue Service and other federal agencies, highlighting the catastrophic risks of relying solely on automated systems when dealing with communities that operate outside the standard administrative framework of the mainland. There is now a greater, albeit still imperfect, recognition that identity theft is not merely a technical error to be corrected, but a profound violation of the victim's social and personal existence. The case has become a reference point for policymakers, a stark illustration of why human oversight, geographical context, and a genuine, empathetic engagement with marginalized populations are essential to the effective and just operation of the state. While this systemic progress is far too slow to satisfy those who had their lives shattered by the fraud, it represents a necessary shift toward a more nuanced, protective posture that may, in the long run, prevent the recurrence of such a tragedy. The internal psychological landscape of the victims, however, remains the most complex and delicate dimension of the story. For many, the recovery was not a linear path but a series of overlapping emotional cycles, characterized by periods of deep, lingering anger, intense frustration at the bureaucratic systems that were so slow to exonerate them, and a persistent, underlying anxiety about their financial futures. The fear of prison, though logically extinguished by the conviction of the true perpetrator, still manifests in subtle ways: a hesitation to open official mail, a palpable nervousness when interacting with government officials, and a deep-seated distrust of any new, unfamiliar administrative requirements. These individuals have had to rebuild their confidence in a reality that they once viewed as stable and safe, a task that is far more difficult than rebuilding a destroyed home. They are survivors of a crime that was designed to be invisible, and their struggle to reclaim their personal narratives is a quiet, ongoing battle that continues to unfold in the intimate spaces of their daily lives. It is important to acknowledge that for many, the aftermath is not a point of arrival, but a continuous process of integrating the trauma into a new, more guarded way of being in the world. As we look toward the future, the story of American Samoa stands as a definitive, enduring warning about the fragility of identity in an age that prioritizes speed and scalability over the fundamental, human-centric values of security and trust. It is a story that refuses to be neatly packaged or easily resolved because it touches upon the deepest, most uncomfortable tensions of our modern existence: the struggle between the convenience of digital technology and the preservation of human dignity, the conflict between the reach of the state and the autonomy of the individual, and the eternal, precarious balance between communal openness and the defensive posture required to survive in a predatory environment. We must hold the story in our minds not as a finished chapter of history, but as an active, living concern that informs how we build, manage, and protect the systems that now define our collective future. The residents of the island have paid an exorbitant, unfair price for this lesson, and the most honorable response we can provide is to ensure that their experience is never treated as a mere footnote or an acceptable, inevitable byproduct of technological progress. Their resilience is an inspiration, but their suffering is a persistent, moral accusation against the indifference of the modern world. In the final assessment, the American Samoa tax fraud is a testament to the fact that when we talk about crime, we are fundamentally talking about people. We are talking about the rupture of relationships, the violation of sanctity, and the profound, life-altering impact that a single, malicious act can have on the fabric of a community. The technical, cold, and forensic analysis of the fraud is essential, but it must never be allowed to overshadow the human reality of the experience. The lives of the victims are the primary, most important text of this case, and their journey back from the abyss of federal suspicion and financial ruin is the only narrative that truly matters. They continue to walk their shores, cast their nets, and look toward the horizon, no longer as innocents, but as survivors who have seen the potential for catastrophe and have decided that their community, their history, and their shared humanity are worth defending at all costs. Their lives are the ultimate refutation of the idea that they were merely disposable variables in a criminal's ledger. They are the living evidence that no matter how complex the deception or how sophisticated the technology, the reality of a human life, lived with integrity, remains the most resilient and enduring force on the planet. This narrative of endurance, of the slow and steady reclamation of one's own truth in the face of an institutional lie, is perhaps the most vital contribution of this case to our modern understanding of justice. The residents of American Samoa have shown us that the path to true restoration is found not in the seeking of retribution, but in the steadfast refusal to let one's identity be defined by the actions of a predator. They have reclaimed their names, their standing, and their peace of mind, not because the system was perfect, but because they possess the profound, internal strength to demand that their reality be recognized. This is a story of a community that was tested by the most advanced, invisible, and destructive forces of the modern world and proved, through their collective silence, their shared suffering, and their eventual survival, that their identity is not a digital asset to be stolen, but a living, breathing, and sacred legacy that cannot be commodified or destroyed by any criminal, no matter how calculated or patient. The memory of what happened will serve as an anchor, keeping the community rooted in the hard-won wisdom of their survival, and in that, they have found a way to live on with a strength that is fundamentally, entirely their own. The final, echoing truth of this case is not the success of the investigation or the failure of the fraud, but the persistent, beautiful, an unconquerable reality of the islanders themselves, who continue to wake up to the sound of the ocean, knowing that they have faced the void and emerged on the other side, more aware, more guarded, but ultimately more deeply connected to the truth of their own worth. The final resonance of the American Samoa case ripples far beyond the immediate geographic boundaries of the archipelago, acting as a profound philosophical marker for our era of systemic digital instability. To close this narrative, we must contemplate the nature of the void that Corina Ifopo exploited, not merely the legal loopholes or the technological oversights, but the profound vacuum of human connection that currently defines the relationship between the individual and the state. The tragedy was not an accidental occurrence. It was the natural, inevitable outcome of a system that has largely ceased to perceive people as individuals, preferring instead to interact with them as abstract, manageable strings of data. When we look at the wreckage left in the wake of this fraud, we are looking at the consequences of a world that has traded the messy, authentic, and often inefficient reality of human community for the streamlined, cold, and dehumanizing efficiency of algorithmic processing. The victims were not just robbed of their money or their peace. They were robbed of their standing as human beings within the eyes of the government, reduced to the status of administrative anomalies that could be interrogated, punished, and discarded with the click of a button. This dehumanization is the most persistent, dangerous, and insidious element of the digital age. It creates a reality where the most vulnerable individuals are inherently invisible to the institutions tasked with their protection, yet perfectly visible to those who wish to exploit them. Ifopo understood this asymmetry intuitively. She knew that the system was built to handle millions of transactions at a speed that precluded actual human understanding. She recognized that by mimicking the language and the logic of the machine, she could effectively render the machine her silent partner in crime. The lesson for the broader world is uncomfortable. We have built a civilization that is increasingly powered by logic we cannot see, processed by systems we cannot question, and protected by institutions that have largely lost the capacity to discern the truth of a human life from the static of a fabricated dataset. If the residents of American Samoa can be treated as criminals because a digital record said so, then no one, regardless of where they live or how honest their life, is truly safe from the potential of a systemic, catastrophic error. The resolution of this case by the FBI and the Department of Justice was a necessary, functional step toward restoring order, but it was not a restorative act for the souls of those who were labeled criminals for simply existing. The system eventually corrected the error because the volume of the fraud forced it to do so, not because of an inherent, proactive concern for the residents. This is a critical distinction that must be understood if we are to prevent the next iteration of such a disaster. The state possesses the capacity to rectify the damage it causes, but it does not possess the capacity to understand the trauma of that damage. It views the world in terms of assets, liabilities, and records. It does not account for the loss of dignity, the evaporation of communal trust, or the terror of being hunted by the very authorities who were supposed to serve as a bedrock of stability. The islanders have regained their standing in the eyes of the law, but they have done so by engaging with that law on its own, cold terms, losing a part of their innocence in the process. Perhaps the most enduring image of this entire saga is the quiet, persistent existence of the victims in the years after the arrest. They did not retreat into bitterness, nor did they demand a global stage for their suffering. They returned to the ocean, to the soil, and to the essential, daily rhythms that had sustained their families for centuries. Their strength is not found in the victory over the perpetrator, but in the refusal to be fundamentally changed by her. They have reclaimed the definition of their own lives from the corrupted databases of the government, and in doing so, they have set a standard for resilience that is both profoundly moving and deeply instructive. They teach us that even in a world that is obsessed with digital identity, the most important aspects of our lives, our relationships, our values, our communities, and our inherent dignity are entirely analog, existing in the spaces between the lines of code and outside the reach of any algorithm. The tragedy of the tax fraud is not that it destroyed their lives, but that it attempted to define them, and the triumph of the community is that they successfully rejected that definition. As we move further into a future defined by artificial intelligence, automated governance, and the total integration of our lives into the digital ledger, the story of the island becomes more, not less relevant. We are all becoming residents of a global territory that is increasingly managed by systems that are just as distant and just as automated as the ones that plague the citizens of American Samoa. We are all, in a sense, living in the shadow of the same digital fault line, waiting for the systems we trust to either protect us or betray us. The lesson from the Pacific is that we cannot afford to be passive observers of our own digital lives. We must demand a state that values human nuance over algorithmic speed, a justice system that acknowledges the reality of the people it serves, and a legal framework that treats identity as a sacred, fundamental right rather than a convenient variable in a tax calculation. The residents of the island paid a price that no one should ever have to pay to teach us this, and the most meaningful tribute we can pay them is to ensure that our societies become more, not less, human in the face of an increasingly machine-driven reality. The final, lasting impact of this story is the realization that the true power of identity is not in the data we leave behind, but in the connections we maintain with those around us. The perpetrator thought she could isolate her victims by manipulating their data, but she failed to break the communal ties that held the village together. Even in the height of the crisis, when the federal agents were knocking on doors and the threat of imprisonment was at its most acute, the villagers relied on each other, sharing what little they had, offering comfort, and sustaining the fabric of their reality through the collective force of their presence. This community, which was so easily misrepresented on a computer screen, was ultimately too complex, too vibrant, and too deeply rooted in the physical world to be truly captured or destroyed by a digital lie. Their story is a powerful, affirmative statement that the human spirit is not a string of digits, and that no matter how sophisticated our machines become, they will never be able to replicate the profound, irreducible truth of our lived experience. In closing, we must recognize that the American Samoa fraud was a dark, unavoidable symptom of a world in transition. We are moving from a world of physical borders to a world of digital silos, and the casualties of that transition are often those who are least equipped to fight the new battles. The islanders were not the only ones to be exploited. They were simply the ones whose story became a lens through which we can see the broader, structural dangers of our age. Their survival is a beacon, a signal to all of us that the fight for our humanity, for the integrity of our identities, and for the recognition of our individual value is the most important fight of the 21st century. We must carry the memory of their struggle with us as we navigate the uncertainties of our own digital landscapes, remembering that behind every tax form, every account number, and every digital file, there is a person, a life, a history, and a future that is fundamentally, irrevocably valuable. The story ends, but the vigilance it demands must be permanent, serving as a reminder that we are the keepers of our own stories, and that we must never allow the convenience of a system to override the profound, undeniable truth of the human beings who sustain it. The island remains, the tides turn, and the community stands, having looked into the abyss of a future that tried to erase them, and having chosen to remain exactly who they have always been. The enduring legacy of the American Samoa case transcends the specificities of tax fraud, evolving into a poignant meditation on the fragile nature of sovereignty and identity in the digital era. As we step back to survey the landscape of this tragedy, we are confronted with the reality that the island was not merely a geographic point of origin for a crime, but a symbol of a deeper, systemic collision between the archaic and the ultramodern. The indigenous population, who had navigated the complexities of their existence through a tradition of communal interdependence, were thrust into a bureaucratic arena where such values were not only misunderstood, but leveraged as vectors for exploitation. This collision highlights a critical, often overlooked dimension of our global administrative state, the presumption of universality. The systems of the mainland operated on the conceit that every citizen exists in a state of standardized digital engagement, a fallacy that Corina Ifopo ruthlessly exploited to build her house of cards. By exposing this blind spot, the case forces us to reckon with the inherent danger of a state apparatus that lacks the humility to acknowledge the limitations of its own automated reach. This failure of perception is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the case to reconcile. When we consider the thousands of hours that federal agents, analysts, and judicial officers spent documenting and litigating the fraud, we must ask ourselves how much of that effort was driven by a genuine concern for justice, and how much was a reflexive, self-protective reaction by a system that had been embarrassed by its own lack of scrutiny. The government moved with terrifying efficiency once its own treasury was compromised, yet it showed remarkably little agility in recognizing the suffering of the individuals who were being crushed under the weight of its own flawed records. This disparity in urgency is a defining characteristic of our modern institutional life, where the preservation of systemic integrity and the protection of financial capital almost always take precedence over the preservation of individual human dignity. The residents of the island were not merely victims of a criminal, they were victims of an indifference that is built into the very architecture of our current governance, an indifference that is amplified by the speed and scale of the technology we have chosen to employ. To move forward from this, we must advocate for a radical reimagining of how we define identity within the state. The current paradigm, which reduces human existence to a series of numerical identifiers, is not only an invitation for fraud but a fundamental denial of the complexities that make us individuals. We must move toward models of identity that are decentralized, protected by the individual, and validated by community rather than by monolithic, opaque servers. The American Samoa case serves as the ultimate involuntary experiment in what happens when we surrender the stewardship of our identities to external, automated entities. The islanders were stripped of their agency, made into ghosts in their own lives, because they had no meaningful way to control the digital projections of themselves that were being manipulated by a predator. This loss of agency is the primary threat of our time, and the struggle to regain it is the defining civil rights challenge of the digital generation. We must demand systems that are transparent, accountable, and fundamentally subservient to the people they represent, rather than systems that treat human lives as data points to be optimized, harvested, or penalized. Reflecting on the emotional toll experienced by the community, we are struck by the immense capacity for human endurance in the face of institutionalized malice. The victims were not just fighting a woman, they were fighting a massive, indifferent, and incredibly powerful machine that was entirely convinced of their guilt. Their ability to persevere, to seek help, and to eventually reclaim their standing is a testament to the persistence of the human spirit. Yet, it also serves as a warning. We cannot rely on the resilience of the vulnerable to compensate for the failures of the powerful. We cannot accept a reality where justice is something that must be fought for with such exhausting, soul-crushing intensity, particularly by those who have the least capacity to bear the burden. True justice requires that we build systems that are designed to be resilient to the machinations of the predatory and that are fundamentally rooted in an understanding of the human lives that exist at the very end of their chains of command. As we conclude this exploration, we must acknowledge that the story is not a closed book but a continuous warning. The methods used by Karina Ifopo have not disappeared. They have merely evolved, becoming more sophisticated, more automated, and more difficult to trace. The digital tools at our disposal are double-edged, offering unprecedented opportunities for connection and productivity while simultaneously creating new, expansive frontiers for exploitation. The lesson from the island is that we must always be the ones who hold the key to our own narratives. We must refuse to be defined, categorized, or judged by systems that do not know us, and we must remain vigilant in our defense of the authentic, physical reality that underpins our existence. The case of the American Samoa tax fraud will eventually fade from the public consciousness, as all cases do, but the vulnerabilities it exposed remain a permanent, looming factor in our modern lives. The responsibility falls to each of us to recognize these vulnerabilities and to cultivate a society that is not only technologically advanced but fundamentally, uncompromisingly human. The quiet, enduring resilience of the islanders stands as the ultimate, living argument for the primacy of the individual over the system. They have chosen to move forward with a cautious optimism, an optimism built not on a naive belief in the goodness of technology or the perfectibility of the state, but on a grounded, profound belief in their own worth and their own agency. They have demonstrated that the strength of a community is found in the way it supports its members when the world tries to break them, and that the value of our lives is not found in a digital ledger, but in the shared, lived experience of our daily struggles and our daily joys. As we move ahead, let us carry their story not just as a piece of criminal history, but as an essential, foundational truth about what it means to be human in a world that is constantly, relentlessly trying to turn us into something less. Let us honor the struggle of those who were lost in the machinery, and let us pledge that our future will be one where such losses are no longer treated as inevitable, but are recognized as the profound, unacceptable failures that they truly are. The narrative of American Samoa is a mirror held up to our own society, and what we see in the reflection is a challenge to build a future that is not just more connected, but not just more efficient, but more compassionate, and not just more digital, but more deeply, fundamentally rooted in the humanity of every individual. The path forward is not found in the rejection of technology, but in the masterful, ethical, and human-centric application of it. It requires a commitment to the idea that our identity is a precious, immutable gift, and that the state, in its pursuit of administrative clarity, has a moral obligation to protect that gift above all else. The islanders have done their part by surviving, by demanding the truth, and by reclaiming their place in the world. Now the burden of history shifts to us, to take the lessons they have provided, and to build a reality where no one is ever again discarded, misidentified, or destroyed by the very systems that were promised to secure their prosperity. The story of their endurance is our foundation, and their resilience is our guide, ensuring that even in the face of $1 million lie, the truth of their existence remains the only thing that matters, the only thing that lasts, and the only thing that truly defines who we are as a civilization. We have heard their story, we have felt their struggle, and now we must act, ensuring that the legacy of their experience is not just a warning, but a catalyst for the profound, systemic changes that are required to ensure that our future is worthy of the lives of those who have paved the way for it. The horizon is wide, the tides are turning, and the truth of their resilience stands as a lighthouse, guiding us toward a more human future where our names are once again our own, and our identities are defined only by the richness of our lives, the strength of our connections, and the integrity of our choices in a world that is finally, truly our home. The final chapter of this narrative is not defined by the completion of a legal process, but by the ongoing process of integration that the residents of American Samoa have undertaken as they reconcile their past with an increasingly uncertain future. To look at the island today is to observe a community that has emerged from a period of profound disorientation with a heightened state of collective awareness. The fraud that once threatened to erase their existence as honest citizens has instead become a defining element of their modern identity, shaping the way they interact with mainland authorities and how they manage their own communal affairs. They have reclaimed the narrative of their lives from the digital ghosts that were created in their names, and in doing so, they have established a new, more resilient baseline for their existence. This evolution is perhaps the most significant outcome of the entire ordeal, as it represents the conversion of a traumatic experience into a form of active, protective wisdom that continues to serve them every single day. The islanders have effectively immunized themselves against the possibility of a recurrence, not by withdrawing from the world, but by engaging with it on terms that prioritize their own safety, their own agency, and their own, deeply rooted understanding of the value of their individual and collective identities. This shift in perspective is an essential development in the broader context of how isolated populations must navigate the challenges of the 21st century. The experience of the American Samoa community provides a masterclass in the necessity of defensive, informed engagement with institutions that are inherently indifferent to the specificities of local life. By learning to scrutinize the communications they receive, by developing internal networks of support for managing administrative tasks, and by fostering an environment where information is shared and verified within the village, they have effectively lowered their collective surface area for exploitation. They have taken the vulnerability that Corina Ifopo once utilized to her advantage and converted it into a source of communal strength. This is not a development that suggests the threat of identity theft has been eradicated. Rather, it suggests that the community is no longer a soft target. They have replaced the innocence that made them vulnerable with an informed, critical intelligence that acts as a natural, self-sustaining immune system against the types of predatory schemes that once devastated their lives. This transformation is a direct refutation of the idea that victims of such massive fraud are destined to remain perpetually disadvantaged or perpetually susceptible to the machinations of others. The broader implications for how we, as a global society, should approach the protection of our digital lives are profound and far-reaching. We are living in a moment where the reliance on external, automated authorities to safeguard our identities is becoming an increasingly untenable, dangerous strategy. The case of the American Samoa tax fraud demonstrates that when identity is treated as a commodity, it will invariably be stolen, manipulated, and profited from by those with the technical capacity to do so. To protect ourselves, we must move toward a paradigm of identity that is intrinsically linked to the physical reality of the individual and validated by the communities in which they live. We must support the development of administrative systems that incorporate human oversight as a mandatory, non-negotiable feature, ensuring that the critical decisions regarding the financial and legal status of human beings are never left entirely to the discretion of an algorithm. The residents of the island have shown us that the most reliable defense against the corruption of our identity is the active, engaged, and vigilant participation of the community itself, a lesson that should guide our policies and our practices for years to come. As we conclude this long and detailed exploration of the fraud, we must also acknowledge the role of the media and the public consciousness in how such crimes are perceived and addressed. The story of what happened on the island was not widely recognized for the tragedy it was until the legal case had reached a point of absolute, unavoidable clarity. This delay in awareness is a recurring pattern in the history of financial crime, where the suffering of marginalized populations is often relegated to the background, considered secondary to the more abstract, systemic concerns of the state. It is our duty, as members of a globally connected society, to remain alert to the experiences of those who exist on the peripheries of our digital landscapes. We must recognize that the integrity of our own identity is inextricably linked to the integrity of the identities of our neighbors, regardless of where they reside or how they participate in the modern economy. When one identity is compromised, the collective sense of security for all of us is diminished, and it is only through a shared, active commitment to the protection of every individual that we can build a truly secure and just future. The resilience of the American Samoa community stands as an inspiration to all those who have felt the crushing weight of institutional injustice. Their survival is not a fluke, it is the result of a persistent, intentional commitment to one another, a commitment that proves stronger than the millions of dollars that were used to divide them. They have demonstrated that the human spirit, when supported by the bonds of community and the clarity of shared experience, is a formidable, enduring force that can withstand even the most sophisticated efforts to erase it. Their story teaches us that we are not just collections of data, that we are not just assets of a state, and that we are certainly not just victims in waiting. We are the architects of our own lives, and we hold the responsibility to protect that architecture against the forces that would see it dismantled for profit. The resilience of the islanders is the foundation upon which we can build a better, more secure understanding of what it means to live, to work, and to flourish in a world that is constantly testing the limits of our humanity. In the end, the case of the Samoa tax fraud serves as a poignant, eternal reminder of the importance of the truth. Despite the millions of lies, the forged documents, and the elaborate, fabricated realities that IFOPO constructed, the truth of the situation, the simple, physical, and undeniable truth of the victims' lives, eventually surfaced and reclaimed the narrative. It is a slow, often painful, and frequently obstructed process, but the truth possesses an inherent, gravitational pull that eventually brings all the noise and deception to a halt. It is a testament to the fact that no matter how complex the system, how deep the corruption, or how large the scale of the theft, the truth remains the ultimate, final arbiter of our collective existence. The residents of the island have embraced this truth, have lived through it, and have arrived at a place of calm, measured acceptance of their history. They move forward with the weight of that knowledge, an anchor that keeps them grounded in the essential, non-negotiable reality of their own worth. Let this narrative be a final, lasting tribute to their strength and a permanent, etched-in-stone warning to the systems that govern us. The story of American Samoa will continue to resonate, not because of the crime, but because of the response of the community to that crime. They have transformed a tragedy into a catalyst for understanding, a wound into a source of wisdom, and a period of absolute vulnerability into a lasting foundation of strength. Their experience is now a shared resource for all of us, a reservoir of insight into the realities of the digital age, and a roadmap for how we might navigate the uncertainties that lie ahead. The horizon remains open, the future remains unwritten, and the truth, as always, remains the only thing that can truly set us free. May we have the courage, the intelligence, and the deep, abiding humanity to ensure that our future is built on this foundation, and may the story of the island continue to guide us toward a world where no one is ever again forced to fight for the right to simply be themselves. The work of building such a world is difficult, often lonely, and fundamentally important, but it is the only work that truly matters in the end. And so we carry the story forward, not as a burden, but as a light, a guiding force that reminds us of who we are, what we have survived, and what we are truly capable of achieving when we refuse to let our humanity be extinguished by the systems that surround us. The residents of the island, in all their quiet, persistent dignity, stand as the ultimate confirmation that the truth of our lives is the only currency that never devalues, the only identity that cannot be stolen, and the only reality that will outlast every system, every machine, and every lie that has ever been, or will ever be told. We are the owners of our stories, and in that realization, we find the strength to move toward a future that is, finally, entirely our own. The final reflection on the American Samoa tax fraud must inevitably turn to the concept of time, not just as the linear progression of events from the inception of the crime to the eventual sentencing of Corina Ifopo, but as the lived experience of those whose lives were suspended in the state of bureaucratic limbo. For the victims, the 2-year period during which the fraud was actively perpetrated was not merely a span of calendar days, it was an era of psychological entrenchment. Each morning that they woke up in their homes, they were unaware that they were being systematically eroded in the eyes of the federal government, their identities being carved out like hollowed-out timber to serve the ambitions of a neighbor they still trusted. This perception of time is vital to understanding the depth of the violation. While the perpetrator was operating with a frenetic, accelerated energy, constantly inputting data and churning out documents to meet the demands of her own avarice, her victims were living in the slow, natural time of their island reality. This fundamental misalignment of temporal experience is what allowed the fraud to flourish for so long, and it is what makes the subsequent task of emotional and administrative repair so incredibly arduous. The trauma is not just what was done, but the length of time it was allowed to persist, creating a profound sense of temporal vertigo that continues to haunt the community long after the court's gavel fell. When we consider the restoration of order, we must also consider the persistent, nagging question of whether true restoration is even possible within the context of a system that is inherently designed to favor procedural finality over restorative justice. The federal government, in its role as the prosecutor and the administrator, has a definitive point of closure. Once the audits were reversed, the liens removed, and the criminal records cleared, the agency considered the case closed. But for the people of the island, there is no procedural finality for the experience of being betrayed, the fear of being wrongly imprisoned, or the loss of the foundational belief that their government was an entity that operated with at least a baseline level of human cognizance. This gap between the state's functional resolution and the community's internal reconciliation is where the most significant work remains. It is in this space that we find the true cost of the fraud, the permanent alteration of a society's orientation toward the outside world. They have shifted from a state of passive inclusion within the broader American fold to a state of active, defensive navigation, a shift that is as irreversible as the passage of time itself. The role of the physical environment in this narrative also cannot be overstated, as the island of American Samoa serves as more than just a backdrop. It is a participant in the story. The tropical landscape, with its enduring indifference to the petty, digital machinations of human greed, offers a silent contrast to the violence of the crime. The way the light hits the water at dawn, the way the breeze moves through the palms, these are constants that have remained unmoved by the frantic, artificial crises of the federal tax system. For the victims, the return to these rhythms was the primary method of healing, a way to anchor themselves back into a reality that made sense, a reality that was not composed of ones and zeros, but of salt, heat, and shared life. This physical groundedness is a powerful antidote to the ethereal, vaporous nature of digital fraud, and it provides a critical reminder that we must always cultivate spaces, both literal and metaphorical, that are beyond the reach of our technological systems. The islanders have shown that when the digital world tries to define them, they can choose to retreat into the physical, the immediate, and the tangible, finding solace in the things that cannot be hacked, forged, or remotely accessed. As we move forward, we must also address the systemic vulnerabilities that remain inherent in the way we structure our globalized administrative hierarchies. The American Samoa case was a symptom of a larger, global ailment, the total centralization of identity in a digital format that is managed by entities that prioritize operational capacity over individual security. Every time we consent to the digitization of our vital records, we are participating in a system that is fundamentally prone to the type of catastrophe that occurred on the island. While we cannot realistically abandon the infrastructure that allows for modern communication and economic participation, we can, and must, demand that this infrastructure be fundamentally re-engineered to prioritize the sanctity of the individual. This means implementing rigorous, multi-layered identity verification processes that require human interaction, establishing absolute transparency in how our digital records are accessed and modified, and creating dedicated, easily accessible avenues for recourse when a compromise occurs. We need a digital world that is as robust, transparent, and human responsive as the physical communities we have spent centuries building. In this endeavor, the voices of the residents of American Samoa are indispensable. They have lived through the failure of the current model, and their insights should serve as the blueprint for the reforms that are so urgently required. Their experience highlights the specific, dangerous blind spots that emerge when policy is written by individuals who inhabit entirely different administrative and cultural realities than the people they represent. We need to center the perspectives of those who have been marginalized by the digital shift, listening to their experiences with an intent to change the underlying structures, rather than simply offering perfunctory apologies for the errors of the system. This is a call for a more empathetic, a more localized, and a more humanistic approach to digital governance, one that recognizes the unique needs and vulnerabilities of every community, regardless of how far they may be from the centers of political or economic power. The residents of the island have proven that they are not just passive recipients of bureaucratic policy. They are active, intelligent, and resilient participants in the ongoing dialogue about what our digital future should look like, and their participation is the only thing that can ensure that future is truly inclusive and secure. Finally, we must look at the way this narrative has been constructed and understood, and recognize that the telling of a story is itself an act of resistance against the erasure that the crime attempted to inflict. By refusing to let the suffering of the islanders remain an anonymous, bureaucratic statistic, we are asserting the importance of their individuality and the sanctity of their lived experience. We are creating a permanent record that serves as a counterweight to the forged documents that once defined them. This narrative is a living testament to their endurance, a record of the fact that they existed, that they struggled, and that they triumphed in the face of an institutional force that tried, and failed, to turn them into something other than what they truly were. As we conclude this account, let us pledge to carry this awareness forward, to remain vigilant in our own digital lives, and to support the ongoing efforts of communities everywhere to reclaim their identities and their futures from the cold, in different systems that have sought to commodify them. The story of American Samoa is not just a tragedy of the past. It is a beacon for the future, a signal that as long as we remain connected to one another, and as long as we remain committed to the truth of our own existence, we are capable of surviving even the most sophisticated, large-scale, and calculated attempts to break us down. The island remains, the people remain, and the truth remains, a permanent, immovable object in the path of every lie. May this record stand, not just as a history, but as an enduring affirmation that the truth is the most powerful, the most resilient, and the most vital resource we possess, and that as long as we cling to it, we can navigate any storm, overcome any challenge, and continue to exist in the fullness of our own, authentic reality, long after the machines have been powered down and the digital ledgers have been cleared. This is the ultimate, final, and most essential takeaway from the saga of the American Samoa tax fraud, that no matter how hard the world tries to define us, we are always, and will always be, the only ones who can truly define ourselves. The story ends here, but the vigilance it has inspired must continue as we look toward a future where our identities are secure, our dignity is respected, and our reality is finally and irrevocably our own.